Steve Keen.
Thank you. I apologise in advance for my very croaky, laryngitic voice at the moment. When I first told my blog members that I was going to be taking part in this debate, quite a few of them said it's a pretty silly topic. You know, what capitalism? How you define it? Is it free market, as Ross was saying a moment ago? Of course it's not. And I thought, well, actually, maybe it is, but there's another way to look at the whole topic, and that's to work from the end of the word, ism, and think about what we do when we describe an ism, whether it's our favourite or the one we most detest. What we actually do is we describe to other people what our dream about that ism is. Now, if you think about a fan of capitalism, they'll describe the dream of a system with great ingenuity, with a price system where prices properly allocate resources, and where the system is fundamentally stable. They used to say that rather more loudly than they do these days, but still. Critics, on the other hand, will jump on poverty, which is less possible to do after China's transformation, as Lucy mentioned beforehand, or inequality, that's still well and truly lively, and instability. That part of the dream is obviously more correct than the fans had. They're talking about exactly the same system, but they have different dreams about how that system functions. The trouble is, what they then do is they wake up and they act on that dream as if the dream is the real world. And I'm going to spoil a movie for some of you in the audience who haven't yet seen Inception. I do recommend seeing it, a very intelligent movie. And part of the plot there is that Leonardo DiCaprio puts an idea in his wife's mind in a dream, very well intentioned, and it's meant to do something in the dream. The trouble is she acts that idea out in the real world and she dies. That's the problem I believe we face with capitalism. We tend to believe somebody else's dream about how the system operates. We act that out in the real world and the dream becomes a nightmare. And my favourite movie on that front isn't so much Inception as an old one by Terry Gilliam called Time Bandits. It had the promotional line that it was like all the dreams you've ever had, and not just the good ones. Now, we tend to forget that. We don't get dreams without nightmares. And what we're living right now is the neoclassical economist's dream. When I introduce myself socially, by the way, I shall call myself an anti-economist to distinguish myself from my neoclassical colleagues. And we're living their dream right now, and that dream is a world where the markets are efficient, by which they mean the markets can predict the future accurately. Prices solve everything, so on and so forth. Now, the result is the financial crisis we're currently in. And most of the world knows it's a nightmare. Australia still doesn't actually know it's starting to dreaming yet, but it still is going into the dream. I'd rather try to bring a bit of realism here and say, what can you say capitalism as a system is good at? And certainly both sides, as you've realised with Paul's opening, say that it's great at innovation. And I'll add one more thing to it. It's great also at things which have a direct link between the innovation and the purchaser of that innovation. So if it's too hot in summer or it's too cold in winter, I'll trust a capitalist system any day to invent reverse cycle air conditioning over a socialist system. And I saw my funniest example of how bad socialism was at that many years ago when my girlfriend's brother decided to buy himself a new motorbike, and he couldn't afford much, so he found he could actually buy a 650cc motorbike for $650, which is about one-fifth the price of a leading Honda at the time. It was a Russian Cossack. It arrived in a crate, covered in oil and rags. When you took the oil and the rags off the bike, you found you were looking at a 1942 BMW, complete with a bicycle seat. So that's lousy innovation, and it causes its own ecological crises as well, as we know from seeing what's happened in Russia. But I think we should also think about these social systems as personalities as well, and I may be politically incorrect here, so I'm good at that, so I'll keep on going. I describe socialism as the paranoid schizophrenic of social systems. Paranoid, we've got Stalin as the best example of that. Schizophrenic, it promises workers' freedom. It became one of the ultimate systems of slavery. Capitalism, on the other hand, I'd call them manic depressive. Gets absolutely euphoric and then crashes. Now, neither system should be allowed to self-medicate. We've seen the results of letting the financial system self-medicate. Back in the 19th century, if you played an accurate historical look at it, you would have said, there's a crisis every 20 years, it's caused by the financial system. If you have any sense at all, reform capital assets to stop this happening again and again and again. Instead, what we do is we go through a crisis like the 1930s, we establish a bill like the Glass-Steagall Act that reforms what merchant banks can do and stops the crisis. And then because it succeeds, we abolish it in 1999 and get back into the same situation again. I'm one with Ross in believing you can't regulate capitalism. Successful regulations will be abolished and therefore lead to another crisis. It's the manic depressive, I don't need to take the medicine. What's actually happened as a result of that is what we talk about as capitalism, the vision we got from the government here, was pretty much the industrial capitalism of the 1950s, when engineers ran companies. When engineering meant you built something rather than you invented a piece of paper that you traded off as AAA to some poor idiot in Norway who then went bankrupt. We are living in Ponzi capitalism now. We don't actually have the engineers running the system anymore, and they're the ones we need to solve the major problems. Instead, we have characters like Bernie Madoff. Now, that's how I thought you pronounced his name until Americans heard me talking about it and said, no, you mispronounced his name. It's actually Madoff. And you think, only in America can you get lines like this, where you can have a newspaper headline saying, Bernie Madoff with the money. But you can also do one, we haven't yet got there yet, but how about Goldman Sachs US Treasury? Now, the real problem with capitalism, and Paul alluded to this, and to some extent so did Ross, is that it's great with those direct effects, but it's lousy with feedback. So it's great for inventing air conditioners, but what if you're keeping your house warm in winter and cool in summer causes global warming? What happens then? That's an indirect effect. That's a feedback effect. Who's going to pay you to reduce your usage? Who's going to invent the technological fix to reduce the impact of your air conditioner on the global temperature level? It's not going to happen because you can't get somebody to pay for it. And when you try to get governments to bring in pricing systems like that, you get the farce of Copenhagen. I happened to pass through there at the time, and the airport had all these signs saying, Copenhagen. My cynical reaction was, not a hope in Hellenhagen. So what tends to happen is that capitalism overshoots. The manic depressive side of it, the fact that you can't get people to admit to the feedback effects until it's too late, means capitalism is lousy when it sees that sign on the road saying, go back, you are going the wrong way. Capitalism, rather like Alf Garnett in the old series, weaves through the traffic faster and then smashes into something bigger. And again, back to Maggie Thatcher. Yes, Maggie may have made that comment about there is no alternative. She also said the lady's not for turning. Well, this lady, called capitalism, has to turn. And we don't really know how it's going to manage to do that. It faces not one, not two, but three crises at once, like a bad episode of Star Trek. What I call peak debt, the financial crisis driven by the bankers, not by the government and not by the poor people who are conned into taking on the loans. Peak oil, which means we're going to run out of the main source of the energy that makes this whole lifestyle we have possible. And global warming. So feedback is the Achilles heel of capitalism. And it may well be that a capitalist system may invent the technology that may help us solve the crisis. But I've got a feeling when it's put into impact, if it is, it'll be done in a very command economy, militaristic way. Now, can we solve these problems? Yes, we can, if we started in 1972 or 75. Then some very careful engineers wrote the book called The Limits to Growth. And they said, yes, it was possible to have a sustainable, prosperous future, but only if we started changing our behaviour in 1975. So we haven't got there. We haven't done it fast enough. We haven't asked the practical questions. How fast do prices adjust? How quickly can technology be developed? Who can bring it in fast enough? We left it to the economists. We should have trusted the scientists. I'm afraid my feeling is that not even capitalism can save the planet.